Howdy folks, welcome back to my YouTube channel. I am your host, the Mighty Bjorn, and today for you I have a Bjorn's Mighty Thoughts video. This is more of a podcast type video where I'm just going to kick back, talk about a certain subject, and just let things roll out from there. And today's subject is going to be focused on the X-Wing. This is actually a flip side to a discussion I had a while ago, and the discussion I had previously was more or less answering a question that I was asked previously about the Empire and why the TIE Fighter, and essentially I made a good case and brought out facts and etc. that explains why the TIE Fighter worked for the Empire the way it did. Today is the flip side of that discussion where I'm actually going to focus on talking about the X-Wing and why the X-Wing was actually the perfect starfighter for the Rebellion. I'm going to play some Star Wars Squadrons footage here of some X-Wing gameplay from Star Wars Squadrons, and I'm going to sit here and discuss some things. Now, the first thing is we all recognize the TIE Fighter as the bad guy ship and the X-Wing as the good guy ship, based on your point of view. Now, there's the one thing that comes out is the Rebellion needed a new starfighter. They didn't need a new starfighter. They just needed a starfighter. At the time, they were relying a lot on recovering old ships from the Clone Wars at scrapyards and the black market to get ships, but they really needed essentially a more officialized, more advanced ship that they could take the fight to the Empire with. Now, when it comes to certain things, there was a lot of rich, powerful members of the Rebellion. So when it came to funding and credits, that actually was not a problem for the Rebellion. It really wasn't a problem for the Empire either, but their military budget essentially was stretched a bit more thin, considering they had the Stormtrooper Corps, they had the fleets, they had the Imperial Army, etc., plus those people needed paid, and then they also had to maintain their different military academies, so that all became a factor in the government spending. So you understand that the government spending for the Death Star was not on the books. That was actually an unofficial project that the Emperor had set up. However, that being said, they would lack in manpower, especially in the early years of the Rebellion, especially when it came to the realm of well-trained manpower. So they needed an advanced ship that essentially could be flown by anyone with little training. No matter what, you're always going to need some training, especially when it comes to flying, something like a plane or whatever. However, that being said, the Rebellion found out about Incom making the X-Wing Starfighter. This was a starfighter that was a private venture by Incom and was made in secret, and actually was considered one of the most advanced starfighters of its time, and probably up to that point, it probably was the most advanced starfighter. Now, it wasn't really a specialized fighter, though. It was more of a multi-purpose workhorse, which worked out perfectly for the Rebellion, with all that being said. Now, that also being said, the Rebellion did have some advantages. There was actually some of the pilots, even early in the Rebellion, were actually Imperial pilots. Imperial TIE Fighter pilots, or just Imperial pilots in general. And they would actually join the Rebellion, and that would actually form the early backbone of the Rebellion fleet, especially the fighter fleet. However, there was a problem there. Once again, manpower. They didn't have a lot of men to fill fighter fleets. So the X-Wing kind of fits the bill with that one. It was a much more forgiving fighter because of its shields. It had a much hardier structure to it. Also, that being said, it also had a lot more firepower, having four essentially quad-linked laser cannons versus twin-linked laser cannons on the TIE Fighter, as well as it also could have either carried concussion missiles or photon torpedoes. Photon torpedoes being the more common loadout, especially by that point, basically by galactic standards by that point. Photon torpedoes was the heavy firepower of choice. Now, that being said, This led to a doctrine because of the lack of firepower, or not the lack of firepower, sorry, the lack of pilots, but really advanced ships, especially advanced ships with hyperdrives. This led to a doctrine of hit-and-run tactics against ships like light cruisers and supply cruisers. However, they also knew that a head-on fight was never going to work out for them. So they took the strengths of the X-Wing, such as having the heavy firepower to be able to take on things like cruisers and stuff like that, and use them for basically hit-and-run tactics. Also, a part of that as well was the hyperdrive. They could strike from anywhere. They would literally fly across the galaxy, hit a known Imperial shipping lane, and buzzer off before the Empire could react. Now, the Empire, over time, would try to counteract essentially this insurgency type of attack patterns. However, it really wouldn't. They really could not mount anything effective against this tactic. Now, that being said, there was moments where Rebellion pilots would actually go head-to-head with Imperial pilots. Now, except for a few times, essentially the few times that we see in movies where they did this, most of the time that did actually not work out too well for them, because actually the TIE Fighter, as a fighter, being specialized in being a fighter, especially an interceptor, essentially a space superiority fighter, it was actually better at that. It was smaller size. It was a harder target to hit. It was faster. However, that being said, too, if the X-Wing could actually land a shot on the TIE Fighter, well, it was certain death for the TIE Fighter. Now, the next thing that they took advantage of is the fact that the X-Wing actually had a life support system. Here you can see Rebel pilot uniforms. And the Rebel pilot uniforms actually did not have a life support system built into them. They were also not insulated for essentially cold weather. They didn't have any environment controls. That was all stuff that was required by the TIE Fighter suits. Essentially, the TIE Fighter suits had to be a sealed system. That was one advantage the Rebellion could take advantage of, because then that opens up the pool of who can be pilots. Now they can use aliens as pilots. Aliens like the Twi'lek, which that's the race with they got like the two tentacles that come out of at the top of their head and usually flow back. I didn't think to grab a picture, sorry folks. But that was one race they could use. They could also use Wookiees as pilots. There's a lot of different races they could use as pilots, even Mon Calamari. However, the Imperial pilot uniforms had to be standardized. So basically, it just, like I said, it opens up the pool of where they can draft fighters from. The next thing that the X-Wing had over the TIE Fighter was actually an astromech. Those ships, the X-Wing had a port for an astromech. What that allowed was multiple things. One, the astromech can actually lighten the load on the fighter. They can do things such as angle shields, adjust the engine thrust, adjust the firepower, adjust the targeting computers, set navigation. They can even autopilot the ship for the pilot. Now remember those hit and run tactics I was talking about? That's where that comes into play. The astromech could actually set a course and pilot the ship most of the way there to the location that they're going to be, allowing the pilot to basically be completely hands-free, maybe eat something, who knows, even take a in-flight nap, if you will, and the astromech could wake them up when they get there. So there's a lot of different advantages having the astromech leads to. Essentially, they had a co-pilot, which is something that the TIE Fighters really didn't have. There was a few models that did, but those were the exceptions, not the rule. The Phantom TIE was one of those TIE Fighters that was multiple pilots. I believe the TIE Bomber could also have multiple pilots as well. But as I said, rules not the exception. Or sorry, exception not the rule. I got that backwards. I'm old and shit. Forgive me, folks. The next thing too is the design had landing gear. And that actually opened up some opportunities there. These were not only a fleet-bound or base-bound ship. The TIE Fighter didn't actually have landing gear. Now, there was the Outlaw TIE that you see in The Mandalorian where the wains fold up and it's actually got landing gear to land. But because the X-Wing had landing gear, it could land anywhere, allowing the Rebels to set up bases anywhere, as well as they don't need to lug around a bunch of unnecessary, essentially, landing clamps like the TIE Fighters needed. Now, that being said, it was fine for the Empire because the ships were stationized in specific locations. That's an advantage that a military has that essentially a rebellion doesn't have. Also, that being said, they were very hardy ships, so it was easy for somewhere to find them to land, do some simplified repairs, and get back out into space if need be. But also that opens up opportunities where they could take the ships to where more specialized facilities can be, and they only use those specialized facilities as absolutely necessary, not to draw unwanted attention to those facilities. So there you go, folks. That really covers it. That's my discussion about the X-Wing Starfighter. I mean, it was the workhorse that the Rebellion needed, and it had a lot of advantages over the TIE Fighter. But that being said, the TIE Fighter also had a lot of advantages over X-Wing. So it's kind of one of those, the TIE Fighter worked perfectly for the Empire, and the X-Wing worked perfectly for the Rebellion under the circumstances that I just put in place in this video. Anyway, folks, thank you very much for tuning in. Hopefully you enjoyed the video, and I hope to see you again for my next video. Thanks again, and have yourself a wonderful day.